Jesus said, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And yet it did not fall, for it had been founded on the rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who built his house on the sand. And the rain fell, and the floods came, and the winds blew and slammed against that house. And it fell, and its collapse was great." Let's look today at why this truth matters. Today, truth is denied, ignored, and resisted with open hostility. Yet in life and in times of crisis, we discover that truth matters. There should be little doubt in anyone's mind that today we live in a society where the very concept of truth is up for debate. There are those who claim absolute truth doesn't actually even exist. They might say that the truth is an idea or a construct which individuals can make for themselves. You can have your truth, I can have my truth. Truth is whatever a person decides. No one should decide my truth for me except me. And while that sounds magnanimous, a statement of fairness in the name of equality, it actually has a very short lifespan. For while it may sound good in the world of ideas or thought, it truly doesn't work in the real world. I want to begin today and talking about the premise behind truth matters. The premise comes out of the scripture that I read earlier. And as you may have noticed, the title, Truth Matters, is a bit of a play on words. With every broadcast, I want to look at the matters of truth. The subject of truth itself is a topic that can occupy many people's minds and conversations today. And we'll be looking at that. And when discussing the matter of truth and what it is, this brings up something that's at the core of the premise behind Truth Matters. Simply put, the truth matters. And the truth matters in many important ways. Now, I read earlier from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verses 24 through 27. In chapters 5 through 7, we have in the Bible the longest recorded sermon by Jesus. It's known as the Sermon on the Mount. Now, in this sermon, Jesus lays out many of his teachings and instructions for his followers. They are pointed and very direct, and they cover a multitude of situations for the followers of Jesus. He speaks about anger, lust, oaths, retaliation, how to react to enemies, giving, prayer, worry. He also teaches about judging others and about asking God for the needs in our lives. In this sermon, we find some very well-known and famous things, like, for instance, the Lord's Prayer. Now, the world is familiar with parts of this sermon. In fact, it even has taken and quoted parts of this sermon without really understanding the full implications of what they're saying when they quote it. You might have even heard people otherwise who would not be connected with Jesus in any way quote from it. One example, again, is the Golden Rule, which comes out of this sermon. And of course, it's not uncommon for portions of the sermon to be misquoted and misused. Let me encourage you to invest some time to read and study this sermon on your own. It's a life-changing treasure of truth. And in the weeks ahead, we'll be looking at parts of it. Now, Jesus concludes the sermon in a very dramatic fashion. I read it earlier. He tells two short comparative stories or illustrations to make his point. He said that the person who hears his words and acts on them will be like a wise man who builds his house on the rock. Rains fall, rivers rise, winds blow and pound against that house, and yet the house doesn't collapse because it's built its foundation on the rock. In comparison, he says that the person who hears his words and does not act on them is like a foolish man who builds his house on the sand. Rains fall, rivers rise, winds blow and pound against that house, and it fell. And great was its fall. End of sermon. No explanation. The illustration speaks for itself. Now, Jesus made the claim that he was in fact the truth. I believe him. Therefore, his words in my mind and in life are more important than any other words ever spoken. Now you might say, well, I don't believe that. I think you can determine your own truth. Fair enough. And so I suppose you could create your own podcast and espouse the truth that you believe. But I believe that the truth in fact exists and can be known. But not only that truth matters. Jesus, in the conclusion of the sermon, declares that what a person does with truth is significant. To hear the truth and act upon it, or to hear the truth and not act upon it, both have consequences. It has consequences on a very foundational level. The very foundation of a person's life is determined by the response they have to truth. The very ground upon which we build every bit of our life is affected by the substance it's built on. Truth is a foundational issue. For instance, if you never learned or can recognize the letters of the alphabet, you'll never learn to read. If you never learn to recognize and know the value of numbers, you'll never be able to solve mathematical problems. If you never learn the language that I'm now speaking, you can't understand a word I'm saying. If the foundation of a life is weak, that life cannot stand against the inevitable harsh circumstances of life. That truth tells us that the substance of the foundation matters. But if the foundation is sound and enduring, then that life will stand against the inevitable harsh circumstances of life. And again, that tells us that the substance of a foundation matters. But there's more. Jesus also points to the fact that a person's response to his words, the words of truth, have inevitable consequences. It determines how a story ends. I'm a writer, and I've traveled to many places around the world. The thing that I've discovered that wherever I've gone, I could use stories to connect and communicate with people. I believe the reason for that is that everyone has a story. Your life, my life, every life is a story. But not all stories are the same. And it's not a matter of how long the life is. It's something else. I've lived long enough also to see that not all stories end well. There are lives that are lived and built on lies, terrible circumstances compounded by poor decisions, incorrect paths, selfish and wrong-headed choices. Books and plays and movies have all been produced to illustrate these very points. Step by step, piece by piece, they lead to what we would call a tragedy. But, even in a tragedy, a great ending can avert even a tragedy. Such an ending is where, before the conclusion of the story, it takes a different path. Different decisions lead to a different place, to a different conclusion. What makes the difference? Well, Jesus said it had to do with responding correctly to what he said. He claimed that he was the truth itself. That, of course, means that what he has said is of utmost importance. But he said that it isn't enough to just know about what he said, to hear it. No, he said that a person needs to act upon it, to agree with it, to believe it, to follow it, to put it in their life. And he said that how a person responds to the truth, he declares that it will determine how a person's story ends. Now, Jesus' words carry an invitation and a warning. The invitation is to hear and to build your life on the truth that he declares. He said that if we hear and do that in our life, it will be strong, enduring, and will stand all the way to the end. The warning, likewise, is that if we deny, ignore, or disregard his words, then our life will be weak and will not stand up against the weight of life. And in the end, it will be a tragedy. It doesn't have to be that way. It can be different. There's still time. This is the reason I was compelled to begin Truth Matters. In the weeks ahead, I want us to explore and discover the truth of God that he has provided. That truth, when applied to life, makes a difference. It provides a foundation for a strong and enduring life that in these troubling days we need. All of us can sense the storms and the waves that are all around us today. How are we to stand in such days? Jesus said it's in hearing and applying his truth in our lives. Jesus invites us to do just that. He also warns us to not ignore what he has said. He told us that truth matters. Over the last year, in the neighborhood next to mine, a new subdivision was born. Now, they gradually filled the bare land in with houses. First they plowed the land, and then they laid the utilities, then the streets, then one by one they built houses on these individual lots. One day, as they were driving by, my wife and the grandchildren, my grandson asked her a question. "Why is that house broken?" You see, he saw the skeleton frame of the house and he thought it was broken. She then explained it to him. "No, that house isn't broken. It's still being built." You see, just like our lives are still being built. Thinking of that incident, and the house was under construction, made me consider something. Building a house involves a lot of workers. There are foundation workers, framers, roofers, carpenters, plumbers, electricians, drywallers, painters, landscapers. What do you suppose would happen if each group and the persons within each group individually decided that they would, on their own, define the blueprints and the measurements and the rules and standards on how they were to accomplish their individual tasks? Every person within each group created their own rulers and measuring devices for their tasks. What do you think that house would look like? How reliable would the outcome be? Is the house level? Does the plumbing work? Would the electrical system turn on? Would the windows open and close? How long do you believe that house would stay together before everything came apart? Would you want to live in that house? Let me ask you, who's building your house? Who's deciding the blueprints and the measurements for your life? You see, in the real world, in your world, truth matters.